Kogen, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
So for people who don't know you, I think people who watch and know Angelo, have been to retreats with Angelo DeLullo, are familiar with you because you're a very special presence at those retreats.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just remember, so for people who don't know you, you're a Zen monk for most of your life, a monastic, truly living in a monastery,
Mm-hmm.
doing the thing, studying with the legendary Zen masters and these lineages that are legendary lineages. And again, I'm using these words lightly,
Sure.
but and now you're sort of exploring what is the intersection of those traditional monastic paths, which seem to be dying off, seem to be disappearing, with the new way that the Dharma, the truth, this indescribable realization of what is showing up now, like YouTube and in-person retreats in the West and
mixing modalities, right?
Whether it's Dzogchen pointing, headless way, non-dual meditation, Adyashanti, just sitting, whatever it is. And then trying to sort through the chaos of what's going on YouTube when everyone has a platform now.
Oh, yeah.
Decontextualize from what used to happen in these traditions where you had a teacher and a structure and a container for these realizations.
Totally.
And so at the retreats, I first met you at one of Angela's silent retreats in North Carolina, and you and Esho, who was your fellow monk, fellow monastic nun, the way you guys would sit in these retreats spoke volumes. Everybody else were lay people, we're householders, we're kind of dabbling in non-duality, trying to relieve suffering or trying to understand truth or whatever it was. And then we see you guys, and you've got your robes, and you're sitting in a way that it's impossible to talk about, but it's like watching a natural phenomena. And the way you moved in between sessions, it was again like watching like a graceful animal naturally move without any hindrance. I don't know how else to say it. It was remarkable. And I was like, who are these people? And so there was something there that was transmitting even just with your presence. And so we got to know each other. You've been staying with me the last couple of days, doing talks in the Bay Area, San Francisco Zen Center, Berkeley Zen Center. And we thought, let's just do a show. Why not?
Yeah,
yeah,
totally. And I remember meeting up at that retreat, and it was kind of funny because kind of coming from a real monastic background and by being an introvert, right? We're kind of we knew you were friends with Angela, and like, oh, there's this flamboyant Zido guy. Well, people kind of gather around you, and we're like, okay, that's good. But actually, when you came up, you're just so kind of kind, humble, and genuinely, authentic in our exchange. They were like, oh, wow, Zido guy is really awesome.
Oh, how sweet.
I remember,
well, that was how I felt, because I was like, I am fans of these two. Because again, there's something there that just radiates through. And especially on retreat, you're sensitized to that space even more. And so let's back up a little. This is beautiful. And I'll get to know you more too through this interview, which I'm really excited about, even though we've been spending the last couple of days talking. And by the way, so for people who, what's it like talking to someone who spent most of their life in a monastery in these traditions with these incredibly powerful teachers? There's something that comes through, guys, that's like, my wife and I were experiencing it, and it you can't really put your finger on it, but it's quite profound. It's a heart-opening experience too, as well as there's an energetic aspect to it. And you're not doing any of this intentionally. It's just how it kind of shows up. And hearing your own path was really fascinating. So you grew up in communist Poland.
Sure, it's like my early childhood was
yeah.
And then post-communist Poland was actually, to some degree, it was even weirder place, because that kind of transition and everybody kind of not knowing what is this whole thing of freedom means. They thought the freedom means the political freedom, right? And here the freedom comes, and everybody feels just so still stuck with their own suffering, right?
Yeah.
So that whole thing, so I grew up vaguely Catholic, nothing too intense about that. But that was the kind of tradition in Poland for over 1,000 years, really. So that's the dominant religious force there. But didn't find really the answers there, right? And at certain point, I was exploring various ways in which, this whole thing called life can be explored and experienced in a different way. There was this kind of intuition that there is a different way to experience reality than just this regular veil that kind of like starts to set in when I was, a teenager. I kind of could feel it, right? This sort of more and more of kind of little angst and kind of like sense of being separate from life, like being apart from it and trying to figure it out, right? So that was kind of, a pretty universal experience, I think, people growing up, right?
Yeah.
And then, trying to explore ways in which you actually address that thing. And, with many trials and errors, I kind of got into Zen, which was very spoke to me. It really hit something in my heart.
How did you discover it? Because growing up as a Catholic, you're probably dabbling in psychedelics and stuff as a kid. You're running around the projects of Poland, doing mischief and that sort of thing. So how did Zen hit you?
I think it was, maybe psychedelics were a little bit part of it. Just kind of seeing like, oh wow, like there is a possibility of a very different way in which consciousness can function here, right? That was one thing, but also just reading a lot of books and trying different things, and then eventually, I think it was Alan Watts's The Way of Zen. And there's descriptions of those Zen masters from Tang Dynasty, which was very very wild. It was kind of like the culture was very rebellious. It was the Buddhism came to China way before that. But it was much more of that kind of like studying sutras, worshiping Buddha, on the altar, and kind of projecting this holiness outside. So it became like this sort of religious,
deity based.
Yeah. And then Zen came in, and suddenly, it was like this disruptive force that was saying it's not about worshiping anything outside. It's actually realizing your true nature, right? And they were doing all sorts of crazy things, right? If you read the exchanges between those masters, it's wild, right? Like they would shout, right? Or they would they would hit the student, or like they would do something to just wake them up from that, kind of familiar worldview, right? So they were wild people. They were kind of tigers.
And what did Bodhidharma say? What is the meaning of all this? Oh, vast emptiness, nothing holy.
Yeah. And exactly, it's like, it's just a remedy, right? It wasn't even a statement of truth necessarily. He saw where's the fixation.
That's right.
And then he gave the medicine for that, right?
That's right.
So in the same way, great master Linchi, who was, master maybe 8 generations after Bodhidharma, he had this famous phrase, "I have no doctrine whatsoever. I untie the illusory knots that appear in front of me."
Oh,
right?
Wow.
So they were very spontaneous, and I kind of responded to that. I was like, wow, that's really awesome. There's some aliveness. It's not like your, Catholic priest in a Polish church, telling you who to vote for and kind of to give the money to the church. It's actually, this really powerful force of awakening that you can do for yourself.
And how much of that, what struck me in what you just said is how customized it was to the individual student's fixation. So now, we sit and you can watch YouTube videos and it can serve you anything about anything at any stage of anything. And like you said, like saying vast emptiness, nothing holy means one thing, but it's not a truth in itself. It's a pointer beyond a particular fixation.
Yes.
Like maybe you're worshiping somebody as a deity, or you're finding that like doing meritorious acts is going to get you some kind of realization. And so, okay, let's point past that.
Yeah, totally.
What's here? But now it's kind of like, ooh, you could get any number of things, and without that that teacher or that direct interaction, it can be a little challenging. And I know I floundered a lot just reading books and trying to. Same thing with you. What is this? What is this? Why are we conscious? Like, what's the meaning of this? Why is it so unsatisfactory sometimes to be alive?
Yeah,
I have everything I want, and yet I'm still not, feeling that great about it.
Yeah.
What is that? So this kind of struck you, Alan Watts's book, and then you found Zen to be just that direct Yeah, yeah.
And again, I was a little bit fooled into it because Tang Dynasty China Zen, which was Chan at the time, is very different from Japanese Zen, right? And it was, whatever, 1600 years apart, right?
Right.
So, before I encountered the Japanese version of Zen, but at the same time, the thread of this directness was still there, but it was in a very different form. So for example, in China, often those teachers would take people like into the room, right, into a Dharma hall. They would give a discourse and they would say, Master Lynch had those phrases like, if there's a courageous one who wants to spread his banners in front of me, I'll test you, right? He had that kind of taste to it, and he would like respond immediately to people how they showed up and what they brought to him, right? What their understanding was. But in Japan, they developed this methodology. Size of monasteries might also affected that you would meet with teacher one-on-one in a room, and basically every let's say morning or evening, depending on the monastery, suddenly there would be like a bell sounded in the far off hall, and all monks, they know this bell sounds, it means you run. Everybody from the meditation hall, as you sat, everybody just literally leaps up and runs. Some of them like not even taking their shoes, and you run and you line up on this kind of corridor before this hall, and there's a little bell in front of it, right? And then when the teacher rings the bell, like a handbell, then the first monk is ringing the bell and then walks towards the room, right? And then you meet and there is some exchange about your practice, about your state of mind, about where are you holding on to, what's going on. And then, when the teacher feels the interaction is over, he rings his bell. And then the next monk is hitting the bell, right? So in that way, everybody goes there and receives, instruction from the teacher. So it's very different format, but the principle is the same. You are getting instruction where you are at, right? Like, what's needed, the next step. You don't need to know the whole territory. You need to know the next step, one single step, right? Because otherwise you might get a little bit confused.
So there's that untying the knots of illusion
Yeah.
one by one in the Dokusan. Is that Dokusan?
Yes,
Is that what that's called?
correct,
I see, yeah. So you guys would book over there to try to...
Yeah,
Wow,
totally.
wow.
Yeah, you'd run.
So you were 23 when you left for Japan, and before that you were singing opera.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, again, it feels like maybe it's completely different world, but there are similarities for sure.
Yeah.
Right? Like that sort of mindset of training something that's nonverbal, and it's related to the breath too, right? Like, it's something you do together. I was more in a kind of choir, choir sort of
young person's choir type deal. Yeah. Traveling all around Europe and everything.
Yeah. And we were going to school at 8 a.m. until 7 p.m. right? So then it's like your day is full, and you are in a group of men. My school was men only. And then of course later in the conservatory it was mixed, but still there was this feeling of like, we are here for a different purpose than most other groups, and we are doing something together, and it's related to our breath, and we are doing it a lot, and later we kind of go around and share it in some way. So weirdly, transitioning to monastic life, it felt like, oh, of course, that's awesome. Yeah.
So you left for Japan, and is that where was your first monastery your main teacher?
That was my ordination teacher, and someone I consider my there's a kind of term root teacher, right? But it simply means like in your heart, it's someone the most kind of who formed your being the most in a certain way, influenced you and helped you in some ways.
And this is Tangen Harada Roshi.
Yes.
Yeah, and I've mentioned to my audience before your book that I read, Throw Yourself into the House of Buddha, which is Tangen Harada Roshi's story told by him. You translated and edited it after his passing, yeah?
Correct. I mean, there was some previous translation. I was correcting the translation a little bit.
I see, yeah.
But yeah, I was involved in that project.
And that book, like, I remember you sent it to me, and after I went to Japan,
yeah, that's right.
And I did a show about my experience in Japan, and you said, "Oh yes, you seem to understand what Japan is about. Maybe you'll like this book." And that was a period where I wasn't able to read much because everything had it had emptied a lot. And I read that book, and I was just struck by the the radiant compassion that came from this person that
Mm.
I will never be able to meet, but I could feel it through your translation and through your own, even the inscription in the book. Like, it was like, wow, this is what this kind of dharmic transmission can feel like, even at a distance, a purported distance, when there's really no distance. But and hearing his stories of, being a kamikaze pilot in the war and going to die that day when the war was declared over, they surrendered, and then feeling like, what is it like, when all my friends have died, and now I'm given this, and that existential sort of questioning that led him on his own path. And then hearing you speak of him and so on. And so that experience, is there anything you can sort of speak of? Like, what was that like for you? Like, what was it like in monastic life under Tangen Harada Roshi at Bukokuji?
Yeah, it's of course, it's as many of our, all of our experiences, really, it's kind of
undescribable. Yeah, totally.
Even the mundane ones, like, it's hard to, we can try to communicate them. But with him, it was very interesting. I have practiced Zen for several years before I went to Japan, right? I was doing, every summer I would do like 90-day long retreat or a month-long retreat. And I was really steeped in that. And, as a young man, you can get a little bit of that arrogance, right?
Oh, totally.
Like, I know what's Zen about, right?
Yeah.
And I remember meeting Tangen Harada Roshi for the first time, and he was very kind of, very, very, very gentle. There's something striking about him from, like, the moment he was kind of coming out, it was like a sun coming out of the clouds. There's something about this kind of presence was radiant, and immediately you just felt like, oh, life is magic, like there's something else here, right? Just connecting with that through just the way he moved, right? And then he came out and he said, in Japan we have this gesture which is called gassho, right? Which is putting the hands together, right? And he said, so let me teach you that. Let's start from there, right? And I was a little bit like, are we starting from gassho? like I came here to really
understand the mysteries of this moment. Yeah.
And then he said, when you do gassho, it's not that your hands come together, it's that whole universe becomes one. And in this moment, like, tears start to flow down my cheeks, and the whole thing stopped. Nothing was moving. And it's not that, sounds were not happening, but it's just my mind stopped completely. And then I was like, oh, okay. I should really stay humble here and follow what this man is doing,
Yeah. Wow. That transmits even now. And that is, wow.
Yeah. So after that, I was just so in love with that life and with him, and it was beautiful. It's a harsh life in some ways, right? Like, depending on the monastery, you wake up between 3 and maybe the most luxurious monastery is 4 a.m. is wake up. But, that's kind of like, that's for wimps.
3 or bust, yeah.
Yeah. But, and for me personally, what was the most challenging was cold. That was the most challenging aspect, because
freezing.
There is no heating inside the buildings. And we're in Fukui prefecture, which is, kind of snowy, colder than the Pacific coast of Japan. It's the Japanese sea coast of Japan. Right?
Right.
So if outside is 30, inside is 30.
Ooh.
Right? There's no difference. So it kind of might sound like, oh, I go for a hike when it's 30. It's no problem. But if you don't have any time to go back to something that is warm, there's no time in the whole day where that's the case. It's a different experience, right? It's kind of more like, like living homeless in some way in that aspect, right? And again, not to kind of like try to make it too scary, but the head monk of the temple, who was there from before I was born, he didn't have any fingernails left.
Whoa.
And earlobes, because through all those harsh winters for decades, it kind of just fallen off. He had some blood circulation problem, so it wasn't, whenever we speak of that, like, some people think it's like, oh, this line between gulag and monastery is kind of blurry here.
Right.
So it's not like, of course, everybody's there voluntarily, and most people are dealing with the cult better than that particular monk. But for me also, my body type is I like to feel warm.
Yeah.
I'm easily getting cold. So it was challenging. It's kind of almost like as if you're in a stomach of a demon of cold that is digesting you over months. You know what I mean? Because in late November there would be snow, and in April session retreat we would still have often ice on the pond in the mornings, right?
Ah.
So it's a long time, when the winter comes, right? And like, oh, if I start to like reference things in my mind, be on the timeline, oh, it's 100 more days of that, or is this or that,
You're done.
yeah.
You're cooked.
Yeah.
So that itself is a powerful movement of surrender.
Yeah.
And, as you were speaking of this, it made me think of our medical training, in particular, surgical training, that kind of thing. You get up at 3, get up at 4, go round. You're not done until 6, 7, 8, 9. You don't have any free time, and it's so structured that you do ultimately surrender to the process, because resistance is not only futile, it is the end. You won't survive it.
Yeah. It is like a forging process, right?
Yes.
Like in the fire of it, and again, maybe it's not as inclusive and
That's right.
as some other approach could be. So of course, in this world, in this relative world of opposites, every single thing has its upside and downside, right?
Right.
So of course, like this is training that maybe it's easier for young people, right? And people who are healthy and all that. But at the same time, I have seen a person who was he used to be a free climber, and he had fallen, and he was paralyzed from back up down, like from the waist down.
From the waist down, yeah.
And he was like, hey, I really want to live this life, and can I come over? And people are just like accommodating him the way it was possible. In the buildings, they are not accessible like for wheelchairs or anything. So he was like literally moving himself across the wooden floors with his hands when he needed to go to Doksan, for example, because he couldn't use a wheelchair on those
parts.
Yeah.
Wow.
So people did it, people who wanted really to access that, they felt that vocation, they were able to access it. It's not for everyone, and it's not the best environment for everyone to bloom in. Some people need something completely different, right? So it's not at all, maybe it's, again, when I was like 23, I thought like, oh, we are the Navy SEALs of spirituality kind of mindset,
Right.
That kind of arrogance. But
right.
But of course, later you see it's just one of the diverse, unique expression in which that whole thing can play out. And Thai forest monks have their set of hardships, but it's a very different way of life than Zen monks in Japan, right? And even just going from Japan to Korea and practicing in a Zen halls there, it was very interesting because of the somewhat complicated karma between the two countries. Whenever they would like, how do you do it in Japan? They would ask me, and I would be like, this is how we do it, right? And the phrase would often come up: "This is not Zen. This is Japanese military culture. Zen is natural. It's relax. Just like water flowing down, no resistance. So it's interesting. The same tradition went to two different countries, right? And how different it became.
Yeah, picked up the karma and the flavor of that. And in China, like you said, it was different than it was in Japan. And all of that came ultimately from Buddha in India.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And it was very different there too.
Very different there. The red-bearded barbarian Bodhidharma.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so you had experience then with Tangen Harada Roshi for how many years then was that?
I was there for, with some, I had some, knee surgery and but I was, for the last 4 years of his life, I was there.
And what was your role in the monastery?
My role was, bottom of the chain, surviving kind of, actually Tangen Roshi's monastery was very inclusive, which was coming from him. Yeah. And that kind of like sense of very high hierarchy, like it was in many other monasteries, was not there, which was very striking, actually, very unusual. And I remember actually going for we bathe together, right? Like as a monks, you all become naked, and you make prostration to the altar in a bathhouse. Bathhouse is considered one of like a meditation spaces, one of the practice spaces, right? So it's Zen life has its ritual, right? So you go in, you chant this mantra of vowing, while I clean both my mind and body together, I vow together with all beings to remain always clear. And I don't remember the other line,
Right.
but there's always some kind of little vow. And then you enter the bath space, and then you shave, and I remember I was there with the head monk that I just mentioned before, and I just arrived, 23-year-old guy from Poland who spent there 2 weeks, and just received the kind of initial, I kind of approved as his student to stay there, right? And he was there since before I was born, right? So so many years, and coming from that, I just felt like, years apart, and I admired him a lot, and I remember sitting there with him, and I asked him, did our teacher, we used to call him always Roshi-sama, which is a very kind of respectful way of addressing an old teacher. And I asked, does Roshi-sama have any successors? And he said, Roshi-sama has many Dharma children like you and me. And I was like, wow. It's like, he just put two of us at one.
Wow.
We are just, we're just all students of this wonderful being. And there's no like divisions and stuff like that.
Wow.
So in a way, I was really young, and I was just like, then I got ordained as a monk, and then I got more jobs, and I used to do opera, so sometimes I'm good in a ceremony department. I'm not good at like, carpentry or stuff like that. That's not my thing. So I would probably often be like in a ceremony department, or laundry, actually, quite a bit. It's just, monastery is like a big family, right? Like there are all those same jobs that we do in a household that needs to happen just on a bigger scale. Like there's like 25, 30 people. So someone cooks, someone makes the laundry, someone's preparing a bath, and it's kind of like very collective living. And that whole thing of trying to address the question of what we are is so central, right? Like to humanity at all. It's not unique. It's not anything new, right? It was always there, and it will always be there as long as more humans are coming to this world, right? And probably those stories that we used to tell each other, sitting around campfire and just staring into fire, for hundreds of thousands of years, sometimes just trying to make sense of it. We'll just tell stories about like, why are we here? Where did we come from? And how do we proceed? Like, how do we live in a way that is not, feeling kind of incomplete or in suffering, right? So in our Judeo-Christian tradition, the most foundational myth is that of the paradise, right? And, the Adam and Eve are there, and the God is saying, okay, everything you do, you can do, but just don't eat the fruit from the tree of wisdom, of tree of knowledge, right? And then snake comes in, and of course probably it's a man-written book, so Eve is the one who convinces Adam to eat. But anyway, humans eat the apple, right? Which means we develop self-consciousness, we develop abstract thinking, and we have that kind of self-consciousness, that knowledge of ourselves, how other people view us, or maybe I'll die in the future, and therefore, I won't be here. And what was the meaning of being here if I won't be here? All those things that come with that apparatus, right? And that movement of thought that creates this, it's like a magic almost, right? Like it creates this thing called self, that we feel like, oh, it's me. I'm the hero of this thing called life. At the center of the universe, it's all about me. Like I meet Zubin, he's a nice guy, but it's like, it's not about him, it's about me.
That's
right.
Main character.
Yeah, I'm the protagonist.
It is
here.
miraculous.
Yeah.
How it happens. Yeah.
Yeah.
So keep talking about this, because this is the central fall from Eden, right? If you're using
exactly. And that's what makes us feel separate.
Yeah.
That whole creating this internal world of that is based in the principle kind of view of myself being the center of the universe, right? And myself being a separate thing from life, right? That is, the whole paradigm in which we find ourselves. And the whole story from here is like, how do we get back to the paradise?
Mm.
We need to just get, whatever means, we need to get back there, right? And then, some approaches would propose, okay, let's believe that if we are good, or if we take on this particular god or belief, after death will return to the paradise. It will be all fine. And even if here it's like this, trials and tribulations, we have faith in that, right? And therefore, we hope to get there. But, of course, there are other approaches, and actually it's not one religion versus other. Each religion has this core of true contemplative, mystical, or esoteric, or however you want to call it. All those words have some connotations, but this core of not religion but spirituality, right? And through that investigation, we can right here, right now, find the meaning of that. The kingdom of heaven is spread upon the earth, right? Like right now, right here. What does it mean in my experience? Where's that feeling of returning to home that we kind of got cast out of, or had fallen out from, right? How do we return back to that?
Mm.
So, through the centuries, of course, different, trials and errors, and through that, the religion started to kind of unfold, right? Like there were some leaders who were like powerful realizers, like the Buddha or Jesus, and they're like, okay, this is what I found. If you want to test it out, feel free. And then there's a following, and then it starts this whole movement, and it's at first is this powerful spiritual movement. Then on the fringes there starts to be like, oh, I actually, I don't believe that I can do it myself, but I want to support it because at least I'll maybe I'll get like a little ticket with them to heaven, right? Like that mindset is pretty strong in our as humans, right?
Yeah.
So through all that, we arrived at all sorts of traditions that, to varying degrees, were preserving those innermost teachings within the religion, that we're actually not speaking about some future reward, but actually investigating right now, right here. What does it mean? How can I do it? What is paradise? What is the kind of delusion that prevents us from seeing it? So Zen is just one form of it, but those traditions develop methodologies and develop their own ways in which, over hundreds of years, there are ways in which, we can go a little bit off, right, in this whole path, in this whole process. So there are some rails in place. And again, every single thing has upsides and downsides. If there's shadow, there will be light. If there's light, there will be shadow. So, of course, with those traditions, they started also to be a little bit like, sectarian, for example, right? They could be like, okay, my way is the right way, right? We have it right. And someone who is saying like, practicing different form, they would say like, oh no, this is not correct. Right? Oh, this is not Zen. This is not good. I mean, it's just the tribal nature of human beings, right?
And hierarchical nature,
Oh
and
yeah.
they want, like you said, some people just want to kind of ride along, and it's still from a sense of separation.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's acting.
Yeah, so here we are, 21st century, right? And we have this ancient wisdom that was kind of carried by those vehicles, right? Those traditions that were over hundreds of years, had their, their wisdoms, their collective accumulation of different maps, different pointers, different, ways of looking at it. And yet, it seems they are kind of dying out, right? And, in the 20th century, or maybe late 19th century and early 20th century, right? This kind of very narrow thing started to kind of spill over the world, right? Like before it was like, if you wanted to join that whole project, right? You have to shave your head, you have to put on the uniform that we are wearing, and you have to follow, and then kind of either beg for food, and depending how the tradition is formed, right? But still, it is something you kind of completely throw yourself into and forget everything else, right? But these days, which is probably, one could argue that this is our one chance for survival, right, on this planet, that we will actually collectively embrace this thing, and it's not just for a few people who, are hungry for it so much, thirsty for that truth that they are willing to leave everything behind, but actually, it is possible for everyone. It is accessible to everyone. And this is absolutely wonderful that these days more and more people are able to find out about it. If you were born, in some village, like maybe like in I don't know, Mongolia, right? Like maybe you have never heard of any form of spirituality because maybe there was some lama in 400 miles from you, but you never traveled on your camel that far, right? Like it's not it's not on your map. So maybe you never encountered that. But maybe in that village right now in Mongolia, someone is tuning in and hearing, things about that possibility and being like, wow, that's awesome. Like I might actually try it out. Maybe I can see, can I do it myself, right? So this is awesome. But yeah, as we were speaking, it's like, there are advantages and disadvantages to everything, and traditions, although they became kind of narrow-minded in some way, and they had also this kind of hint of arrogance of we know all suffering, we know how to fix everything, right? And initially Buddha also himself, right, like he was kind of comparing himself to a physician, right? He was saying, I am a good doctor and I have 84,000 medicine for sickness that people have. But I can prescribe you the medicine, but I can't take it for you. You have to take it, right? So there is this kind of parallel, to kind of medical world, you could say, right? And the Buddha himself was, was truly a powerful figure, and he made so many tools. But at the same time, these days, we know something more about, let's say, trauma, right? We know something more about different modalities that are kind of really targeted at coming from a place of research or trial and errors, or actually, even accessibility of certain things, right? Like if you have someone who went to war and maybe actually MDMA assisted therapy is something that could help him way before, he could actually go for a meditation retreat and get benefit from that because, right? He can get...
Instead of sitting in the meditation retreat and just having all that stuff come up with no container and no support and just the silence to meet it, if you're that traumatized, that's right. So having these modalities, the modern modalities is helpful, but it's also, so to play the counterpoint to that, because we're talking about duality, right?
Yeah.
So, my friend Ron Purser, who's been on the show, has written about this. The traditions like the one you came from, they had a culture, a container, a support network, a group, a community that could reflect back to you, that could provide support, that could put in context when you're having a dark night of the soul sort of adventure, as these things empty out, as the illusion starts to unravel a bit. It can be so turbulent. And so that can be a very powerful container, despite all the downsides of the hierarchy and the discipline and maybe not fit for everyone and not accessible and all the things. But so now you have all this stuff, but it's decontextualized. And so you have people having spiritual emergencies, you have people having psychiatric emergencies, you have people who give up because they had a challenging meditation or retreat and no container to hold it, and they said, I almost gave up, because the more I would meditate, for a while I went through the Theravada sort of mind illuminated, like I will power through this like a machine and I will get through all the stages. And as I got around stage 4 or 5 of like really that breath was just everything and the distractions weren't there, what happened? The unconscious started to flood. And I found myself reactive and angry. And my team, Tom Heineber and Logan back then, they'd be like, hey, did you meditate today? And I'm like, why? Am I totally Zen? Like, no, you're an asshole. And they could just tell that it was unleashing some kind. And I had no support container, teacher, nothing.
Yeah.
So there's those extremes. So I think where I feel you have so much to offer now, being sort of a little bit on the other side of the monastic piece. It's like, okay, so there's all this, that there is this kind of support, and there's also all this opportunity, like you mentioned, MDMA and therapy and psychedelics and energy work and whatever it is, all the different, we talk about the different threads sometimes on the show, you know, emptiness, energy, unity, psyche. Addressing what's arising with the right modality is nice, but it is nice to have a support, a container, a guide.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I fully agree with that. And it's you know, it's true when you live in the group of 20 to 25 people, and again, monasteries can be larger or smaller than that, but you know, that's actually roughly, I think, the group number of people that we used to live as a hunter-gatherers, like for hundreds of
Yeah.
thousands of years. So it kind of feels
Tribal.
Yeah, it feels natural, like, oh, you know, that feels good to be in that group of people. Like, you know everybody very well. And people do reflect back on you, like your team, right? Like,
Right.
you know, you think you have this great spiritual experience, and then it's like, you know, everybody's a mirror right in front of your
Yeah.
face, like, oh, actually, you know, I'm acting actually not that compassionate or like kind of self-centered in some way, or like self-righteous, or you know, all those things, right?
Yeah.
So having that container is very helpful. Of course, in our context, we lived with our teachers, right? So that's also like, you have to go there every day, no matter what, right? You go, you hit the bell, and you go to this room and you meet face to face, and there's like, you know, no hiding. You know,
Mm.
that person is very perceptive, is very clear, and then whatever you bring to that room, you know, whatever you're carrying around the monastery, you're bringing back to that room, right? And then, you know, you are really encouraged to go beyond those limitations all the time, you know, through of course through the forms too. Like, you know, monastic life is, it's kind of like you have to give up small freedom to gain great freedom. You know,
Mm.
that's one of the tools. Of course, you don't have to. Like, people do it in their homes, and you know, but this is one of the tools that, because you don't choose and pick and all the time have what you want, and you are exactly in your comfort zone,
Mm.
you are actually gaining freedom that simply there's a freedom of having what you want. It's kind of like when you smoke cigarettes, right?
Mm.
One freedom is, you say like, okay, I won't be smoking right now, right? And then suddenly you get the urge, right? And then, you know, there's a small freedom of like, okay, I'll just get it, and
Mhm.
then I smoke it, right?
Mhm.
But there's a greater freedom. I will never need to smoke again, right? Like
Mm.
I'll just drop it. I'll just go
Mm.
beyond that, right?
Mm.
So in the same way, there's a greater freedom that comes when, for some time, we can pick them up later, it's okay, but for some time we actually relinquish all ways in which we feel we are in control over everything,
Control.
our life. You know, and because we live such a individualistic lives these days, you know, we used to live even in like a multi-generational families, right? Like, you know, there are grandparents in the house, there are kids, there are parents, you know, and everybody had to like get along, kind of find some middle ground there. But of course, these days we don't do it that much. You know,
Mm.
it's we have our situation that we are really in control of, and we really like it. And you know, there's nothing really wrong with that as long as we are free from attachment to that, right? It's totally
Mm.
fine.
Mm.
But it was fascinating to see, you know, one of the monasteries that I was staying at, which was Toshoji, where Esho was, and it was like a training monastery, and often people who are coming there, sometimes from abroad, were coming because they wanted like a teacher certification, because they needed to do this particular kind of priest training in order to get that certification. So sometimes there will be those people coming from, you know, France or Germany or US, you know, to do that little training, and they, in their sangha, in their local community, you know, they would come and give a little talk, and you know, be in a leadership position, and everybody's like looking up to them, and you know, and that's great. But then they come to the monastery, and 1 week in, sobbing and sort of like, I can't deal with it anymore, right? Because in monastery you don't have any privacy. You
Yeah,
sleep in the meditation hall one by one, and you have one tatami width, which is
like
probably,
that.
you know, like that.
Mm.
And you sleep on it, and the next tatami is someone next, right? And if you happen to be next to a snorer, here
Mhm.
you go. You know,
Mm.
y- and you eat there in the same meditation hall. You meditate there. Everything is in that small container. It almost feels a little bit like embarking on a ship when you go to monastery. Like there's monastery gate, and it's like a contained space that you are kind of constantly together on, and kind of you don't leave, and you have to simply be in harmony and see where you kind of have those little sticky points that are kind of like pointy and kind of like getting in conflicts with others, or like where are you out of your comfort zone, right? So sometimes those people who can speak with confidence and be like, oh, I know what Zen is about, and I'll tell you what this koan means, and giving really brilliant talks. But when they come actually, to the monastery, it's like, oh, okay, this is a little bit of a different, it's testing to some people. So that container is kind of like a mirror, like it shows you all the time, like, okay, how are you doing? Like, oh, sure, you have great experience. That's wonderful. But let's see how are you when things get a little bit difficult here. When we sit in a 4 layers of robes, and it's 100 degrees and a full humidity. It's not like a California 100 degrees. It's like a tropical kind of 100 degrees, and you're just like, getting rashes on the skin from it, and or frostbites in the winter. And it's like, it is this like training in equanimity that is, moment after moment, it's testing you, right? And you have insight. Oh, this is wonderful. That's beautiful. But let's see how you can embody it. To which degree you can live this truth, right? The old saying, to know but not to be is not yet to fully know, right?
So this is that's beautifully said. It's because it's not, insight is funny. It's like, yeah, I've had a fair bit of insight. The embodiment part, that's the trick. It's almost like you're filling a bucket that has a big hole in the bottom. So the insight comes in and out the bottom it goes the minute shit hits the fan, or you're challenged. And even the simplest expression, if that might be, of what you're pointing at in monastic life with the forms and the structure and the roles and the community and the reflection in the mirror, is it your first silent retreat, where you go in thinking, okay, I need just the right cushion. What if my neck starts to hurt? What's the food going to be like? Am I going to be able to sleep? Is there somebody else in my room? All that. And by about day 3, you're like, oh shit, like this is, all that has fallen away, and you're being faced with you in the deepest sense. And the first time that happens, you realize, oh, you can't learn this in a book. You can't, there's only way to do this is through embodying it. And you see how you are.
Yeah.
You see what's there. And it is a beautiful thing. And so that tradition, that ability to do that is starting to fall away. Now there's residential options now where and Esho, your partner in crime, works in that space. But let's back up for a second, because I think there's a couple questions that I had that I think the audience might have. Is number one is like, is celibacy a part of this tradition in Zen?
So in Japanese Zen, which is like this kind of maverick, tradition within the Buddhist world, it's actually not.
I see.
Sometimes, depending on the lineage, some teacher might actually say that this is part of the agreement. But it happened in 19th century, in 1868, the sort of Meiji era, the big changes in Japan, and they decided to let go of that. Or like, actually, it was a little bit imposed by imperial kind of decrees, because they wanted to Buddhist monks kind of come closer to how Shinto priests were, and so that was just part of it. So right now, most of the traditions like Thai monks, Korean monks, the Buddhist world is celibate, like monastics are, but Japanese Zen is not. And also it was a little bit like, that was loose to some degree for quite a bit. There was this famous teacher, Kukai Kobodaishi, and he had a wife, and it was like, that's just what's happening.
Yeah.
So Japan was a little bit like, prone to that kind of like ambiguity, not in a negative way, but they they have their own rules.
Yeah.
They like,
Yeah. And then, so the other question I had is, so when you're embodying this practice every day in the forms and the rituals and the ceremonies and the daily activities, how do the politics and the interpersonal dramas play out in monasteries? Because I've heard quite a bit about this, and it can get a little dicey and in itself be a teacher.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, again, everybody thinks like, oh, you go to monastery, you'll have a peaceful life and all that. It's like monastery is like a microcosm of humanity, right? Like you get all sorts of people, and often like in Buddhism, if you want to like summarize the kind of pitch for Buddhism is we know answer to suffering. So who will show up at your door? You know, a lot of people who experience suffering, you know, in a kind of more overt ways. So of course there's, you know, there tends to be all sorts of people in a monastery, and that in itself is also, you know, it's part of it, right? It's that this kind of cooking pot in which you are, and of course in daily life we have similar things. Like you have a boss that you don't like, right? You go, you know, you kind of just go by for those, you know, 8 hours, and then you go back home. But then you can go back home and you can complain to your wife and say like, hey, you know, this asshole, this and that. But here's like, you know, you live together, you sleep next to the asshole. You know what I mean? You eat, you serve the food to the asshole. Like you have to find a way to kind of live in a harmony, even with people who not necessarily are someone you would ever become friends with outside, right? So
Right.
that's part of it, and I don't kind of glorify that in terms of like, oh, you know, that's is just simply what we are as a human beings. We are complicated mammals with a lot of strange ideas, and when we come together, of course there will be conflict, and there will be, you know, and I would say sometimes it's a little bit depending on the teacher, like something about that. Whoever is at the center of that mandala will draw people who kind of just resonate with him or
Right.
her,
Right.
right? And then, you know, some monasteries tends to be way smoother, and with Tangen Roshi it was like that. That was my experience. I you know, sure there are like a couple troublesome people here and there, but overall I really benefited from my older brothers and sisters, and just being around those people and learning from them, observing them. You know, it's beautiful too. Yeah.
So you know, many people would say, oh, you know, running off and becoming a monk is running away from life.
Yeah.
But it feels to me like that's not what you're saying. You're saying you're actually going into the microcosm of life and facing yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because, you know, it is so fascinating that the thing, for example, that people who, you know, are in a gang and it will, you know, will shoot you like without a blinking an eye, and they are like, in some ways they're pretty fearless people, right? And then they go to prison, and there's one place they're really afraid of, and that's solitary confinement. Because then there's them in their mind. There's no distraction, right? And um, in a certain way, monastery is kind of like going into that solitary confinement, kind of confronting yourself head on, because all the problems with life are not the problems with life, are problems with, you know, the way you interact with life, the way you resist life. And of course, it's not to say that, you know, when we see injustice, the compassionate, you know, action that prevents that is not, you know, a natural response. Of course, it's not like that we have to accept everything and
Detach and
you know, but at the same time, you know, all the source of our suffering, our internal created suffering, dissatisfaction and you know, self-hate and a sense of unworthiness, all those things, of course, you know, we might have been conditioned by other people to you know, have that experience, but at the same time, this is what precisely affects the way we relate to life and everybody in it. So I would say, you know, going to a monastery or a retreat, it's not escaping life. It's precisely confronting life head on to the source of problem, the very root of, you know, greed, anger, and ignorance, right? Those forces in us, those shadow spaces too, right? That we kind of, they are controlling us, and yet, you know, we it's easy to blame, you know, oh, this person, my boss is an asshole, right? And sure, maybe they actually have toxic behavior, but at the same time, if we can't sleep at night because we are like raging in our mind how horrible this person is, you know, this is a pattern that is kind of down to us, right? Really, it's not that person's problem. You know, it's one of those things. And again, so how do we, you know, because it might sound like, oh, you know, this monastic life is just like so great, and you know, it's like an ad, everybody should do it. But at the same time, you know, many people actually don't bloom in that environment necessarily just because of the restriction of it. And also, there is, in this kind of more traditional classical sense, there's like close-mindedness about it. Like this is the way it's done.
Yeah.
Like some monasteries these days, let's say in a Soto school, there's this trend of like, oh, it's just sitting. And they wouldn't even give you instruction about like, even they wouldn't use those phrases of like just relinquish all points of attention and just rest in the open field of consciousness. They would just say just sit, because this is and of course maybe for someone who's like really karmically very ripe and clean and it's easy, sure, maybe they'll just sit and in that they will see through things that they need to see through. But for most of people, actually, you need some skillful means. You need some tools. Like it's a very dynamic process, and it's a deconstructive process, because we have created so much filters and so much this whole tower of identity in which we relate to the world. It's we need to kind of like look at it closely and kind of see through, examine. It's not like trying to create some experience. It's actually examining what is there and being, okay, is it true? Is it true in my experience that I am, horrible person, right? Like, where do I find that outside of the thought? There's a thought arising, okay, or maybe there's a feeling. Maybe I'm thinking those thoughts because that's easier and more familiar than actually going to the feeling that feels, it feels sad. It feels like, I was abandoned or something, right? So, okay, instead of, going to that, let's just stay with it, right? And there are ways in which maybe they're not intuitively obvious to some people, right? So we need to have those tools. And in some monasteries, there are people who could be there like for 30 years and are banging with their head on the wall, metaphorically speaking, and sometimes
right.
not.
Yeah, sometimes not, right?
And yet, they may be not getting the exact help they need.
Right.
So this is also, there are some limitations to that. But also at the same time, this approach where all the information is everywhere, it will have some amount of
collateral damage.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
We were speaking about this young gentleman who kind of got really freaked out and dissociated, and it's one of those things. It's like the old Chinese story about the man who loved dragons, and he was making origami, and he was buying statues and everything, and then one day the real dragon is saying, oh, I hear there's this man who loves dragon, I should fly over and say hi, and it's flying, and as soon as this dragon is appearing, the man is like, wah! And just running away. And this is like a parable that just speaks to that of like, you might have some interest, and yet if the pointing is exactly maybe not the right for you, you can get really freaked out and kind of spooked out by it, because to the spiritual path or endeavor is really to go beyond what we think we know about reality, and experiencing it kind of in more direct way without that whole conceptual overlay, right? And sometimes it's scary to let go of the known, right? That's why humans, right? Like they, fire was so powerful, like because we could enlighten the darkness that was descending upon us, right? Like the unknown is the scary, where the danger could hide, right?
That's right.
So whatever we can't know, it's unsettling.
And what's key there is that we're weaving an illusion of knowing using things like that. Like we're like, and now I know. But when you really investigate, you realize, I don't know. And then the fear response. So actually, let's talk a little more about this, because for me, especially, I have this video platform, so people can watch me. I'm one of these voices out there that's shouting out into the void, and the algorithm could inflict me on you. And at the wrong time, I've said things like, you don't exist, or, when I'm feeling that emptiness thread arising, and for me, it feels like liberation. For me, it feels like a deep freedom in that moment. So I'll speak of it on a video very directly. There may be people watching who they're sitting on a pile of trauma, and that realization is catastrophically destabilizing or causes nihilism to arise or something else. And then they're by themselves. And so then there's this feeling of like, as a doctor or as a Zen Roshi, do no harm.
Yeah.
So do we not speak of it? For me, this has been an internal struggle. Like sometimes I'll interview someone about threads, like Pierre Salguero about threads of awakening, because it's a model that's so inclusive that people might find solace and say, oh, no, this is showing up for me, so it's okay. But then the downside of that is now they're focusing on another map. And they're conceptualizing something that's actually unknowable. So how do you think about this as someone who is deeply, and we'll talk about the different insights over the years, but how do you think about this, or embody this is a better way to talk about it?
Yeah, it's fascinating, and there is no like a right answer, right? Like, we can have our opinions, but it's one of those very complex problems that each approach will have its strong side, and as we were speaking, in Kabbalah, right, they would give the emptiness kind of no self kind of teachings only to people who are 40 at least and had family, right? So they have some grounding, they have some rooting in like, okay, there are some things that I'm responsible for here, and I kind of, it won't let me kind of just
spin off,
right? So on one hand, we have that traditional approach, which is a little bit, can be of a gatekeeping, right? Oh, it's only for special few, and
right.
Therefore, the other extreme is like, okay, it's all open everywhere, and it's kind of like, it's your responsibility.
Yeah.
Do it at your own risk.
Yeah.
If
trigger warning.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Or I guess the extreme version would be no trigger warning. It's like, it's completely out there, right? And of course, some people are trying to say like, hey, it's not for everyone, and be sure that you are prepared to kind of maybe, it's kind of an often question, because the mind tries to prevent us from going into the unknown with the things that we fear the most, right? So for parents, well, when I talk with some people, often they would say like, oh, because I won't be able to take care of my kids, and all that will play out, right? And some other people were like, oh, I have a business, I won't be able to operate. So of course the mind is producing that, and it's just, in most cases that's not true. But if we are 100% honest, it might.
That's the key. That honesty is actually a kind of truth with a capital T. It's like, we don't know.
We don't know. Maybe your life will change.
Yeah.
And the question is like, okay, do you feel like it's worth it? Do you feel like that you have that thirst that otherwise you just can't? And again, it's not to emphasize, for the most people, you will be probably better parent have seen through your own stuff,
BS,
right?
Yeah.
So it's not to kind of like make it too spooky and discourage people. It's just a matter of like, whenever people are asking me, oh, but will my life stay the same? It's like, maybe not.
Maybe not.
Maybe
not.
It's I mean, life is a constant flux. It's just this fathomless, mysterious thing that is unfolding, and the illusion that we can control our life to stay the same is, it's one of those ways we fool ourselves, right?
Fundamental root. Yeah. And so in my feeling as a physician, I feel like, we do a lot of things in medicine. 100 people you might treat, you might cause harm in 5, you might help 50, and the others might be neutral. And we're willing to accept that as a balance of, okay, I can live with that. And I think in this space, for me, it feels a little like that. It's like I can talk to you, and some people will resonate with that transmission, and that'll be very helpful. And they might even have a shift or an awakening or an insight or an embodiment that they didn't have before. And I hear those stories all the time. But then, I might go do a rant about, today I realized nothing is happening at all. Like this is total mystery. And a person or two might get fundamentally destabilized. And that may happen, but there may be another 20 people that they're like, that's just what I needed to hear at that moment. That particular bodhisattva arises, and the bodhisattva is just an appearance of us and reflected back to me what I needed to hear. And the algorithm was the mechanism of that. And it's all a mystery why it all works. So,
I would agree to some extent. It's like, I think it's good that the teachings are out there and anybody can access it, because we need change on a larger scale than just like, few monks in the mountains.
Yeah.
Because, it's not like we have necessarily food problem in this world.
Right.
We have greed problem. You know, very few people get a lot of resources.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, half of Africa is not having enough,
Right.
food in that day to eat, right? So most of our problems come from fundamentally our own minds, right? And collectively. So addressing that is truly, and especially, with AI, right? Like it's wherever the humanity is heading, AI will bring us that faster. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because
It's an amplification of our own mind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in a certain way, it's like this bottleneck kind of place where humanity, we have climate change, we have AI, we have so many, we have yesterday's, the US bombed Iran, and so many uncertainties, right? And there's this event horizon, we don't know where we are going. But what really feels important is actually find the cure for that greed, anger, and ignorance within ourselves. Be the change we want to see in the world. What else? We can get all helpless and all worked up and all angry about all issues in the world. And, there is a place of direct action too. I don't say it's not, valuable. But at the same time, this fundamental way in which we can address those things that we see there in ourselves, because they are there, each of us has some, little greed. We'll choose like, I'll just choose the kind of, let's say, more convenient and less worse for environment option because I can't be bothered, right? We can relate to, all of us have that problem. I was trying to, go for retreats to North Carolina, by train, and it was like, 16 hours from New York, and it's, and then a year later, I kind of got lazy. I was like, the flight is cheaper and faster, right? And I did, so we all have that kind of tendencies in ourselves. And of course, some are much more benign and some are, more impactful. But addressing them primarily in ourselves is the way we can move beyond. So the teachings, they can't stay in those chambers. They can't stay in those little, places where the old priest with the beard is kind of like telling it to two disciples. And, it's simply the world is calling for larger change. And, we'll see whether it will happen or not. I'm not necessarily subscribers like, oh, this new earth is emerging right around the corner. That's, I mean, that's awesome.
A nice story.
I would love that to happen.
Right.
Absolutely. Right. But so how do we kind of tie those two things together, right? This kind of support network and actually having, be able to access someone who walked that path before us and actually has some wisdom, right? And yet try to still make it, fully accessible. And there, there are some ways, that we can try, this day, the culture is of that. And, probably pandemic didn't help with that either, that everybody's just like scrolling and okay, oh, this spiritual video, I'll watch it. And then, okay, this video and they think this is being on a spiritual path. Right. And it's kind of like, sure, it's kind of like as if you want to become a doctor and you're watching videos on medicine and it's like, oh, this guy is saying something good about vaccines. Okay, I'll listen to that. Oh, this person knows something about cream to the skin and, like whatever. But it's kind of like there is certain fire in which you are forged as a medical professional that you can't actually get it from the videos. You can get some knowledge. Of course you can, right? But at the same time, there's something else that needs to happen. So first of all, I think retreats is such a powerful tool.
I agree.
We shared some retreats together, and we agree on that. So for someone who actually, I'm watching those videos and I didn't have that thing that they're talking about yet, and getting all frustrated. So okay, have you ever been to like a retreat? That's the first maybe question, and talk to someone who actually had that kind of whole unfoldment before you, right? And this is powerful tool, and it is accessible these days to everyone. And,
yes, everyone. Everyone. I'm adamant about that. Actually, if that's calling, if this path is calling in some way, you've watched videos, you feel stuck, and that's how I was. I even had spontaneous, first awakening, whatever that means, and then years of reading books, years of watching videos, years of different meditation strategies at home, mind illuminated, Theravada, everything. And the first retreat I did, it just melted all of that into oblivion, and it was just the heart exploded and Kundalini out of the top of the head and feeling that, that unity energy of that how would that even have occurred? It could have occurred spontaneously, of course, but having the group of people. This was a small retreat Angela was hosting in Monterey. It was my first retreat. 30 people. Many of them were like fans of my show, so there was all this self-consciousness that I had to sit with those people in silence for so many days, and then in the evenings we would speak. So we would do some group processing, and so it was actually helpful to kind of contextualize what am I experiencing, and it was the most powerful experience, and it just dropped me off the cliff. And so, yes, I agree. I think retreat is something accessible in an almost monastic sense for people now.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of resistance to them. Yeah.
I mean, again, and it's so fascinating how coming from a different maybe context and perspective, it's like, sure, if people are in that, let's say, that kind of maybe neo-Advaita
right.
or non-duality.
There's nothing to do, who's doing it, right.
And it's kind of like coming from like a Buddhist background, which again has its own, leanings, of course, and I see that. But it's so funny when people like when you say word practice, it's as if you say word shit. It's like
they get all triggered.
It's like
practice.
Why
would you practice to get where you already are?
Yeah,
right.
And it's like, all right, okay, I mean. It's not that this style of pointing is never valid.
That's right.
It can be, again, like we were speaking about Bodhidharma, vast emptiness, nothing holy. It can be like that. It can take certain sickness.
Right.
But at the same time, if you're like one trick pony with one size fit all,
that's right.
It's like, and also, to some degree, I feel like, meeting people like Tangen Roshi, and again, I don't want to limit it to that, because for me also meeting Adyashanti had that same flavor of seeing someone profoundly embodied and truly, living embodiment of that truth to a high degree. And of course, no one of us is perfect. No human being is, perfect human being is an oxymoron, right?
It doesn't happen.
It's just, but yet, there is a spectrum. And when we, even our own, putting aside that people can just keep watching videos and getting nowhere, even if you have actually some taste, you get some awakening or some true breakthrough experience, we can say like each single of those experiences for us, right? Like it also had a flavor of like, I know the whole thing.
Oh, absolutely. Revealed truth. I'm done.
Yeah, exactly. This,
it's almost a signature of it.
Yeah. There is that kind of confidence. And then if you have absolutely no one around you who can be like, all right, that's awesome, but let's look at that.
Yeah.
And then you might just kind of be, okay, I'm now the next coming. And
start making videos,
start being out there, and you have your some disbalances in your view, right? Like you're either too attached to like the empty aspect, you're almost like nihilistic, like it's all a dream, it's all illusion, right? But in a Zen monastery, if you'd bring something like that to the Zen master, he would probably take a stick and hit you on the head, and if you'd be like, ouch,
is that like, an illusion?
All right, suddenly illusion is a little bit more real, huh? There are ways in which you can counteract those disbalances.
That's right.
So people who have those experiences, my own was the kind of initial opening was 17 years ago, and and later there was another one and another one, and it kind of, there is those maps when you read them, there is a collective body of wisdom sometimes, and some guides embody it and know it, and they are able to point you, and traditions collectively have those things, and again, one example that just comes to mind was Tulku Urgen Rinpoche. He was this famous Dzogchen master, and he spent, after many experiences, he still spent like 6 years in a cave, just really investigating that. And different teachers would come and visit him, and he would he would talk to them, and just because he really wanted to clarify that and embody it profoundly, right? And then when people are around this person, it's like, oh wow, like immediately you see that this person actually has fully, or not fully in terms of like completely, but profoundly clarified those things in themselves and embodied them, and they live them. They are living, example of that, rather than, someone who have some, experience and then kind of like get into arguments online with people because, your approach is not good and it has to be that way, right? It's something, okay, So there's, of course, there's a danger of like putting at the pedestal those great masters and be like, oh, that's not for me, who I am, that's also another disbalance. But because as human beings, we have our tendencies. We lean this way or the other, and therefore having a group or having someone to kind of check in with is so helpful.
Yeah.
Because can prevent those disbalances of occurring.
So, okay, so I'm going to, as always, being a narcissist, I'm going to relate this back to me because you're just a projection of my mind, Kogen.
Let's hear it.
Everything you just said is it's beautiful because, like, for me, my unfolding has been public. Mm-hmm. So I can't help. It's part of Zubin's wiring that he flaps his mouth when something is realized. Mm-hmm. I'll go make a video. Mm-hmm. So you can see videos where I'm like, all the gurus are bullshit and the truth is this, or everything is empty as this, or oh no, it's all made out of love, or no, everything is just consciousness. Oh no, wait, there's nothing to do. It's just lifing. Mm-hmm. I've said all those things and meant them in in all these videos. Every time I make a video like that, I have enough friends now that are very clear, beautiful, compassionate, radiant, embodied beings. I will get a text and it will say, I saw your video. I love how you said this particular aspect. Let's get on a phone call. I'd love to catch up. And they will very compassionately and skillfully point in the way the Zen master would have hit me with a stick if I said everything's an illusion. They would show me that, oh no, also there's this. Yes, and also this. And it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. So people might even in the comments on my video say, but in the last video you said, and now you're interviewing Kogen and saying, and it's like, yeah, that's how it goes. So it can feel like that too. You can almost feel like, because like you said, each insight is like, oh, I've got it now. This is it. And I'm going to tell everyone. Yeah. And there are some people who seem, and again, I don't want to be too judgmental because it is my nature actually to be judgmental. It's like one of Zubin's things. So there are some people who feel very stuck in a certain part of that realization and they're making video after video after video after video after video. And so it seems like you can get something out of that when the sickness you're trying to help is remedied by that. Yeah. But then it's okay to let go. It's okay to say that's not everything. It's okay to say yes and to the next thing.
Yeah, it's like, sometimes the image uses it's like two arrows meeting mid-air, right? So it's like there is a sickness, there's something, and you shoot an arrow.
Yeah.
And it's not because you want your arrow to reach the other person. You want both arrows to fall on the ground, off. Right? It's that remedy rather than this is the ultimate truth. And, of course, that's the beauty of having both, those networks of support and friends, and also just having that humility of like,
I don't know what's going on.
Right? And through that, you're able to navigate that, in a way that is, but even, let's say when you have great masters, like, like legendary realizers, like, Master Dogen, right, from Japan, who brought Soto Zen from China to Japan. My good friend, he had this saying, if you know a quote from Dogen that you don't know the exact opposite quote for that quote, you don't know Dogen. Because this whole thing is paradoxical, right?
It's so funny because as you were saying Dogen, I was like, oh, I have a quote for you. And I don't know the opposite to it.
Okay.
It's the quote, to study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self.
Yeah.
Forget the self is to be actualized by myriad things. To be actualized by myriad things is to, what is it? Is when others' bodies and minds drop away and your own body and mind drops away. No trace of enlightenment remains, and this no trace continues endlessly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is absolutely beautiful quote also because it encapsulates it so much, right? Like it's so in each line, there's such a powerful teaching that it's truly, there's a lot of facets that it embraces, right?
Very encompassing, yeah.
But of course, you would find Dogen, let's say like late Dogen, right? Like when he was kind of going back to kind of more Theravada almost teachings. He got donated like a Pali canon from some aristocratic lord, and he would read them, and he was saying things that were like very different from some of the things he said before, right?
Ah, beautiful.
So it's like, even within one person's, of that, sort of teacher, because human beings are a walking paradox, if you put things into language that is kind of like a binary or dualistic thing, you will inevitably just take a side, right? And say something. So, of course, at a different point, absolutely something opposite is called for to be said, right? So that's what I like, about approaches that don't take themselves as a holders of ultimate truth. Because in a certain way, I love that phrase, there is no the way things are.
Yeah. That I find to be, I don't want to say it's ultimate truth, but I'll say, boy, that resonates.
Yeah. So it's kind of like each of those things are simply a medicine for a certain disbalance.
That's right.
So therefore, it is helpful to have those networks. If you're engaging in something, let's say if you are learning medicine from YouTube, right? Watching just like, oh, well, this person said, and then testing it on yourself, there is a chance you might get sick at some point and ruin your health, right? Because there are all sorts of ideas out there. So in the same way, this spiritual endeavor is for everyone. So of course, no one wants to limit that to some special exclusive club. It is possible for everyone, right? But of course, that includes if you have severe trauma, maybe at first work with that. And maybe that's not necessarily answered in Vipassana retreat. Maybe that's answered with like a trauma therapist that needs, to really guide you through that, that particular, unfolding.
Yeah, and I think that's where like this language, this particular map of the thread model might be helpful for some people, because you say, oh, okay, if psyche thread stuff is coming up, trauma, conditioning, finding a specialist in psyche thread to help might be the best approach, rather than going to the specialist in emptiness, which might be the Theravada monk who'll say it's all illusion, just focus on the breath. And then this unconscious insanity is arising and it's overwhelming your nervous system. It's overwhelming your capacity to cope.
Yeah.
And they're telling you, just sit with that. And, maybe for some people that would work. But for many, it's like, you got to get that root of like.
For most people, that will not work.
Won't work. Yeah. And you hear stories like the Willoughbys and others have written about spiritual crisis that come from these long Vipassana silent retreats without a lot of support and flooding the unconscious material coming up. And again, it goes back to the monastery. Like there's support for that. There's holding for that. There's community for that. There's a teacher on site with you.
Yeah. And again, if there is a, something in a spectrum that teacher, those teachers are also not like trauma specialists, right? They didn't get that training.
That's right.
They deal with a bandwidth of suffering that is mostly just based in that kind of primary mind identification, identity, and so forth. But, again, you get tons of support in that, and you get the feedback, about your behavior and everything.
Right.
But at the same time, sometimes methods that are available there are also sort of limited. So now it is kind of this question. Okay, how do we combine the
modalities,
the good sides of those both worlds?
Yeah.
Right? How do we have communities and support networks that are, they might be more democratic than the kind of Asian kind of like, this is the guru and this is the student, and some teachers are really discouraging that model and are really trying to be more democratic. And, I think there's a great value in that. But how do we create those communities that are not just the sort of consuming things online, but actually with your body and mind, bringing yourself to the table and either doing a retreat or practicing with group of people? Like, when I was starting, it was still, the internet was kind of very, very preliminary. And if you wanted to hear a Dharma talk, you just buy a ticket to Warsaw, 4 hours on train, go there, go to this particular Tibetan center, and there's some lama who will give a talk, and maybe it wasn't a great talk, and you have to go for hours on the train back to your hometown, and but at least you had to put yourself into it, like you really had to be there in a physical space with others and practice, have some support actually, being around people and being able to check in with people. Yeah. And this is I think important, and that's a little bit of like that, our interest of, kind of like people who came out a little bit of that monastic life, feeling that actually that kind of narrow-mindedness has its drawbacks. And at the same time, I want to say that also I'm so happy that there are traditional monasteries out there still.
Yeah.
And they are offering absolutely authentic kind of by the book kind of traditional training, because some people will benefit from that tremendously. They will respond to an archetype of a priest even, right?
Yeah.
They just have that connection. And some people will actually the opposite. They were like, I don't like this whole religious stuff, that's not for me.
Yeah.
And that's why we have to have diversity of places and methods that
Yeah.
are bringing to life different flavor of it,
Yeah.
because different people will respond to it differently. So I'm not saying, oh, the old ways are bad and the new ways are better. It's kind of like they both have something to offer. And if the place, let's say, that is very this in traditional training is doing a training, and then there's a person coming, and this is where we need to find some kind of consensus of humility. When the person is coming and it feels like actually they would benefit from something else, we should be able to communicate that to this person. Because there's so much, I have seen it so many groups. It's kind of like, oh, there's a strength in numbers, we want to have a big group, and therefore whoever is showing up will totally take you in. And if you are making no progress, we'll say that you are not making enough effort because our method is great. You know what I mean? And it's like, okay, that's that's limited.
Doesn't fit. So okay, so as because we've been talking for a bit now.
All right.
Yeah. So let me ask you a question, because I can't let you escape without putting you on the spot for a few things. We talked about insights, and you've had several shifts. I'm going to ask you one question that I know is not a great question. But I'm going to ask it anyways, because maybe you have a great answer for it, or something arises. And that is, if you could say there's one particular insight that you can communicate in some way, even embodied, that would have the biggest impact on relieving human suffering, what do you think it would be from all your training or all your experience?
Yeah, it is a very challenging question, just because each insight is showing kind of another layer of, actually is seeing through another layer that was piled up in this kind of castle of projection and internal world, right? So each of those shifts, and just for like a radical simplicity, there is this kind of realization of pure presence, of beingness, or I am sense of that, just consciousness that is free, right? It's not identified with thought. It's just, it feels inherently beautiful and free, right? That pure presence, and it it just feels so complete, and it is absolutely wonderful, right? But then there is also like natural outgrowth of that. There is this way in which we can clarify that actually in our perception, the sense of there being a subject to it, it's a construct. It's actually not the case when we look at it very carefully, and time after time, and it's maybe not as easy to access that if we have not realized that pure presence, right? um some teachers talk about this, up and out movement, and then down and in movement of awakening, right? And then, of course, there's this kind of falling away of any sense of separation. Because we can say, that's the whole point. Like sometimes we use those phrases like, oh, I don't exist, right? But, those words has arisen, right? So in a certain way, it's almost funny to argue that
It's hilarious. Yeah.
I don't exist as a separate thing from the universe. That's very clear in my experience, right? But so I would say, if I would have to boil it down, that's just how it's appearing here. And again, if we talk, tomorrow, it might be totally different answer. Is seeing through separation, seeing through illusion that I am apart from life. Everything else is around me, and I am at the center of it. But what is this I? Right? When you ask someone to turn around and be like, okay, I am here is a thought. Okay, so there are thoughts, granted, right? There are sensations, and we say like, oh, but because this is my body, right? But okay, this is my body is another thought, right? So all I have is actually sensations, right? And if I look really clearly into them, it's like, oh, they're cloud-like, fire-like, which means there's constant twirl of little points of experience, pixel of experience, coming and going, arising and dying, right? So this thing I called body, my body, is exactly of a nature of a waterfall. If I look at it from a distance, I'll be like, oh, that's a waterfall. It's a noun. It's a thing. It's out there. I see waterfall. But if you come close, just the rushing current, nothing solid, just this constant points of that. When you see it, it's already gone, already gone, already gone, right? So this my body suddenly becomes nothing else but just this cloud-like, fire-like, open field of points of experience, right? That's it. And then there are thoughts arising, but it's not like between thoughts, whatever this truth is disappearing in a puff of smoke. So it's not like the thoughts are defining anything. They're simply arising, right? Sounds are arising. The colors are vivid, beautiful, right? So the sense of apartness from the universe, from everything, from life, from reality, is this fundamental way in which we kick ourselves out of the kingdom of heaven, time after time. Because there are moments, there are some moments when that is kind of, when you're like really passionate about surfing and you are riding this wave. And in this moment, suddenly it's like there's just this flow, there's just this magical life, just this breeze, and you don't define any of it. It's like, oh, it's a nice wind today. It's like, no, it's just that one experience, continuous, right? Beautiful, vivid, luminous, right? And therefore, people are willing to risk their lives to revisit that. That's why people climb without ropes, because it's like, I'm so forced to be present that there is nothing between me and this movement of climbing, right? They're willing to risk their life because they don't know this is possible in each and every moment, because it's our birthright. It's here for us, for everyone, right? And we can, through a process of truly clearly looking at our experience, we can truly live in that way all the time. And of course, we will have some challenges. We are not like perfect transcendent beings, of course. But it's like the basis from which life happens is not that mini me at the center of it all, being freaked out, being angry, wanting to manipulate for outcomes. It's life. It's life itself. It's right here. And it's, and therefore, from that perspective, when we see sadness, it's a sadness. It's not my sadness, your sadness. It's a sadness, and the compassionate heart comes online immediately because there's no separation. It's like, oh, he's sad today. It's like, oh, it's experienced vividly. It's, and from this point, we can transcend those boundaries as a humanity, right? We can go beyond that me versus you, my views, your views, I'm better, you're worse, all that whole thing to the, not to the perfect degree, because this is a mess, right? And in a certain way, we say like it's like a lotus growing from a muddy water. On one hand, our experience can be beyond that, and still our roots are in the mud, and we'll crawl through it sometimes, and we'll have struggles, of course. But there is a way in which we can go beyond that whole thing that sets us apart and makes us destroy each other in the end, right? And makes us fight. So truly, that insight of non-separation, I would say this is the essence. This is birthright and our pathway if we want to continue on this planet, as a thriving species, and not as like, cockroaches, survivors of nuclear disaster, kind of thing,
Ah, Kogen. Wow. I'm glad I asked that stupid question. I have to say, like, I've never met Tangen Roshi, but like, I could feel that compassion, that energy in that transmission. That was absolutely beautiful. I hope the audience can feel it too. Oh my gosh. I don't think there's anything else we can say today. Yeah.
I think that's it.
Yeah.
And like, I'll just maybe like do a plug that, we are sometimes trying to do like month-long retreats to
Yeah.
bring that kind of component of, a little bit longer, staying together and being, and people actually, we have done that a couple times, the sort of month-long retreats, and people actually really feel the value in going not just for 5 days, but actually living in that way together, and being together, and kind of reflecting to each other. And we're trying to find the ways to kind of bridge that gap. And of course, we don't have answers, right? Like we have questions, and that's the beauty of it. We are exploring it, and finding some ways to kind of take part in this larger community of both kind of spiritual community and humanity, and check things out. Like, our background is in the monastic kind of um training, and that's what we kind of bring to the table, and we are open to kind of hear how other people are doing it, and trying it, and it is a living exploration. And so far, yeah, we are trying to do a little bit like longer retreats and see how that unfolds for people, and people do report finding tremendous value from it. So
Okay. So this is the key thing, the takeaway from this video for people who resonate with what you're saying, which I think will be a lot of people. How do they find what you're doing?
So I created like literally probably like month or so ago, until the pandemic, didn't own my own computer. I didn't have a bank account. I never had a car. I never
You're
rented
you're
apartments.
literally living out of a van when you came here. You and
Rented
Esha.
van, yeah,
Rented
rented
van.
van,
Yeah.
yeah. But I have a website now, which is See Your Nature, which comes from Bodhidharma actually. Bodhidharma, when he tried to define Zen in very short way, he said, um, direct transmission outside of scriptures, not dependent on words and doctrine, directly pointing to each person's mind. See your nature, become a Buddha. Yeah.
Oh, beautiful. So it's seeyournature.org.
seeyournature.org.
I will put it in the show notes. And are there links on that site to where you can join retreats and also the books that you have? I'll put you links to the books as well.
Yeah, I don't think maybe. Maybe in the resources tab, there should be something.
But I'll put them in my show notes. Yeah,
right.
So people, because you not only throw yourself into the House of Buddha, but your new book with Esho,
yes,
which is called what is it? In This Body, in This Lifetime.
Correct.
Yeah. And what's that book about?
Those are 30 stories of awakening of women in Japan between 30s and 50s.
Wow.
In that kind of Second World War period.
Right, it's a very traditional society. Yeah.
And practicing under this female Zen master, which there's not many accounts cherishing female spirituality in Asia generally, right? There are very few. So she was this powerful teacher, and her message was exactly that: it is possible for everyone. You can realize it for yourself. So instead of having it only for monastics, for the rare few, she was taking on anyone, and they were like 73-year-old village women without any education, illiterate, couldn't try. They had to tell someone this story, so they write it down for them, right? And
wow.
And 20-year-old girl from Tokyo who's just really freaked out by living in a World War II Japan, right? And mother who lost her son in the war, right? And going through horrible grief, and working through that in that context. So this is like a book that is also like gospel of this is possible for everyone. This possibility of liberation is not limited to anyone, and those 30 stories are really speaking in their own voices, their own trajectory. How did it happen for them in this very particular narrow context? Which again, it can look in so many different ways. And very often I'm bringing up actually our mutual friend's example, who she was. Kind of triathlonist, and she has PhD in psychology, but she almost never meditated, and really just inquired and communicated with some guide. And so it doesn't need to be like athletic meditation for 14 hours a day in some meditation hall. It can take different forms, but as long as we are kind of humble and open, and kind of have some network of support, it's possible for everyone.
Yeah.
So this book speaks of that, very traditional, kind of very intense way. In the Second World War, the airplanes were flying, bombing Tokyo, and they were sitting in retreats, during that time. So of course, it's like, there's that flavor of life and death.
Yeah.
But that felt like a important publication because it was a Dharma sister of my own teacher Tangen Roshi, and she introduced him to Zen practice.
Wow, that's right.
So,
oh, beautiful.
Yeah.
Good. So we'll put those links. And, again, we've been mansplaining quite a bit during this, monks and all that. But this is a beautiful book that brings also that feminine aspect of the spiritual awakening process, which is more and more coming online now, but wasn't a traditional part of the monastic life as much, right?
Yeah, I mean, there were always nuns. There were always great female realizers all through the centuries, but their lives were not recorded and not cherished in the same way as the big, male teachers' names.
That's right.
So it's like a humble sort of contribution to that whole dynamic but also primarily because I feel like almost that great female Zen master Nagasawa, over celebrating her legacy, she would want to have that message of because that's why the book came out in Japan. That's why she published it with those stories that she asked all those women to write.
Yeah.
To prove it's not only for a very few somewhere in monasteries. It's actually for everyone. It's possible, right?
Beautiful. Okay, wonderful. Oh, Kogen. We didn't even know what we were really going to talk about when we sat down, and it turned out perfect.
Yeah,
absolutely perfect.
Yeah, it was great. It was a blast. Thank you.
I feel like, whoa. I mean, it's energetic sitting with you and hearing you express. It's really beautiful, and I hope the audience, the three people in my audience that remain after I only talk about spirituality these days, get something out of this. I think they will. And so we'll put links to your website, to your books. I'm hoping the next time you swing through, we'll be able to talk again, whenever that is.
Yeah.
And I want people to share this video with people that they think it will help. Go ahead and leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, all the usual stuff. Leave a review if you're listening on the podcast. And Kogen, until next time, the piece about the gashao.
Yeah.
I'll never forget that. Beautiful.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Kogen.
That was awesome.
See you next time.
See you next time.